here is a 1911 Lorraine Dietrich. And what I found fascinating is before they invented flames for hot rods, they had snakes. Um, this was before the First and Second World War, and I think most of them were stripped for the lights, which they needed for anti aircraft lights. Um, but I just made that up, so none of it makes sense. Uh, They got the army green right and the spare wheel, and there's a little wooden box for, well, I don't know, something or another. This is a completely inaccurate evolution of the motorcycle. First, they had pedals, they still needed a third wheel. Then, they made a petrol motor, which helped things along rather nicely, but still um, a third wheel, which didn't really allow much success in the Isle of Man TT. Then petrol was discovered in the form of a yellow can, and they made a bike with his initials on, AJS, in case he lost it, somebody could return it to him. It's a V twin, very much like my V Strom, except I think my V Strom has a performance ECU and pipe, so I don't think it's quite as fast, but it must be English made because there's an oil pan underneath. And then they made another two-wheelers with an oil pan underneath, because that was well, they called it a sunbeam, which sounds a bit like a flea market toaster. uh, they got a headlight because they're, well, daylight savings and all that, and they still put their initials on, BSA. So that guy AJS over there had two bikes and a large budget for oil because it still dripped. Then they got the oil can dispenser, which they found in the form of a red dispenser. He was only number 10, so not that great. Um, and yeah, so this is quite nice. But then they went and added another third wheel, and that's mostly because they didn't have Checker 60, so grocery deliveries were quite, well, they didn't exist at the time. Um, but this one could go at night also. Was it had a headlights? Not quite the headlights, because by those were used in the war. Um, he had a some cruise control and stuff like that, and a big running board. I guess that's for high heels or some shit. I don't know. But again, back to the third wheeler, and I guess at some point in time they realized that three wheels was not very efficient, and they should rather just have two, because these tires were probably handmade and very expensive. Electric starters, not really a thing of the past. This is the Le Zebre 1909. Um, I'm sure those are paraffin lamps. This one's got a license disc, which is, I guess, someone's got the papers. Imagine paying the licensing fees per year on all these bloody cars. But this is quite nice. It's a nice color. I guess, I don't know. Maybe those are paraffin lamps and they kept bursting into flames, which is why they make fire engines red. But a bit of an ornate seat there, so, well, it must have been comfortable. Because there's not much in the way of leaf springs there, so I guess they needed the cushions. Here we have the 1910 Wolseley. This was when pinstriping was developed, and then that's sort of when they moved away from the snake heads on the car to pinstriping and flames. And I guess this car is very interesting because not only is it the inspiration for today's hot rods, save for the can there, which they still keep original but put nitrous oxide in. and matching rims, which is kind of like where Lexus got their rims matching the paintwork. Um, there's a nice divider in the middle, so it sort of stops you from knocking into each other when the car definitely, if you look at that very high center of gravity, it's kind of like a London double decker bus. And I'm fairly sure this is where the Prado gets its inspiration from when it was trying to be the least stable vehicle on the road. Um, I guess a couple of fingers have cracked well, a couple of guys have cracked their knuckles on those leaf springs trying to start the thing. But again, nobody had invented a starter motor. I don't know why, because they probably needed crane motors to move this thing around. And so they could have just put a little one in there and you wouldn't have continually cracked your knuckles on the leaf springs. But they have a few more leaf springs than the other one. So a little bit more comfortable, but safety was paramount. That's why you have the divider between the seats for when it invariably would fall over. A 1911 Ford Model T, although nowadays we refer to it as the Model T Ford. So I'm not sure how accurate the sign is, but they also do have a wood frame, but they've got a multiple disc clutch, which are, I guess, sort of bikes got their inspiration from this, and a torque tube drive to the rear axle. I guess that just means that it can twist. Uh, these guys have learned from the other one not to put the starter between the leaf springs because you crack your knuckles. So what they did instead was put one leaf spring across the top. I'm not seeing a limited slip diff on this or any other kind of differential that would sort of, I don't know, give it some stability. But their oil leak, oddly enough, came from the joints on that, or is that brake fluid? We don't know. But back to the pinstriping theme and fire engine red, which explains the hybrid electric headlights and paraffin headlights. So if you're in an accident, well, I guess you needed it to be a fire engine. Um, the windshield allows for good airflow through the car so you could smoke and not burst into flames. Very, very good design. This was when Ford still built really good cars, unlike the Cougar nowadays. But I guess the Cougar also bursts into flames, so they should have made them red also. Another Prado inspiration, very high. It still goes high. This one you get to sit on top, so when it falls over, you can jump out quick and not get damaged. Um, they realized throughout time that the cars are all leaking oil and brake fluid. So what they did was they decided to wisen up a bit and not even bother with putting an engine in, because if there's no engine, there's not going to be an oil leak. So I guess that's where the Toyota design really made a turn. Here we have the Ford Model A Coupe. Um, this was sort of 20 years later, so I guess there's no more paraffin. But they had these sort of spoke rims, which I guess was okay. Hybrid headlights, well, headlights and fog lights, and things were starting to go a little bit faster. So the addition of a hooter or horn, as Americans say, very, very, very important. And then a big sort of bumper for the deaf people who couldn't hear the horn and couldn't see the lights. There's a big enough grille to allow good airflow, so I'm sure it's got a radiator. Um, but this one has to have an electric start motor because cranking that, I mean, you're just going to smash your shins on the bumper. So I don't know about the colour also. I think it's awful. It wouldn't be my first choice. And there's a very out of place orange stripe down the side. So I guess it's not really different from the model nowadays boards, just weird stuff stuck all over. Here's a 1928 Plymouth Roadster. They had wooden wheels because, well, wood was cheap. Uh, Also, the huge bumper in the front, and it has to be an electric start because, again, that little starty crank hole was, it kind of looks like a Plymouth Prowler, really. They haven't changed much. Do you like the styling? They at least got stuff to match, so not too much can be said about this, except for their camber, maybe a bit out. But wheel alignment centers those days were few and far between. This is a 1926 Talbot. Um, by this time, they had invented an electric motor, so the hand cranking wasn't really necessary. And so, oddly enough, at that point, they stopped putting the big bumper on, which would have cracked your knuckles, but they had a motor on, so I don't really understand that. It seems like the temperature gauge sits in the hood ornament. Um, Maybe the guy's eyesight was only long, could only see far, or whatever. So yeah, I think these guys were the pioneers of the um, electric starter motor and presidential assassins. So Ford 1915 Ford Model T, uh, unpronounceable name. The leather strap because bits kept falling off. So I guess they weren't quite up with the Plymouth on the electric starters, but they had the headlights and the indicators, well, paraffin indicators, which was a bit of a pain if you had to keep lighting them to turn left or right. But these guys now had two horns, so they had one there operated by hand, another one there operated by hand, and I think that one was more ornamental because they needed something to match its one and only rearview mirror. They decided to make it out of wood because it was around about the era of 1915 when they decided to start making amphibious vehicles. This is the only surviving sample because the rest of them failed dismally at being amphibious vehicles. This is the Zotta Franschini. It's 1922, and well, not too much can be said about it except for they had a dual temperature gauge on the bonnet, and again, war was looming, so that they still had their headlights all stripped for the headlights. Looks like they had sort of brake shoes in the front, so brakes were starting to happen in those days, and it was pretty big, so more like a family SUV. And this one doesn't leak oil, but they do keep a spare can on the side. It's pretty bolted down, so I guess their suspension's crap. And really ornate headlamp lightings in those days were just resolved with putting a shower pipe over there. Um, a very unsuccessful sort of chauffeur screen there. Fortunately, the chauffeur screens you get nowadays are a bit more soundproof than that. I mean, that's not even rainproof, but oh well, it's got a canvas top, so I guess it'll do. They had a very, very useless sort of side mirror, which I think window, which they just put out when they wanted to light their pipe. So yeah, it's great, big. Um, that's big bonnet. So here's a 1940 Packard. Um, It had a Go Faster hood ornament, and by this stage, the color orange was invented. It looked red, and this really, really cemented the start of the US hot rod movement. As you can see before then, all the colors were bland street yellow, even though it's a Studebaker, and you don't see a lot of Packards on the road. You see a lot of Studebakers on the road. Um, It's only because those became hot rods and the brakes weren't so great and they crashed. So this is the Aston Martin DB2. This is 1956. They really made it look very fancy. and decided, let's make a movie. We'll call it James Bond. So Aston Martin may live on forever through some really great movies. This is a 1993 Alfa Romeo RZ. Our first thought it was a BMW that was inspired by Alfa, but as it turns out, it's an Alfa inspired by Alfa, I guess. Not too fond of the rims, but that's what it looks like. So as you can see, in the 50s, steel started to become common and cheap, and that's why they made the cars a lot bigger, because they could find more steel. Up to then, steel was rare. They could even make them longer and put more people or dogs or cats in the back. That one's got a lowered suspension, didn't have airbags then, so when it was lowered, it stayed low. And various paint colors were also invented. Um, so did multiple headlights, which is quite interesting because there's about 14 to 30 headlights on the front of a Ford Ranger. And I think they got the inspiration from the 1959 Cadillac. Um, these guys got their paint color inspiration from mud, which, anyway, this one came with a free diagnostic machine. Nowadays, they're more portable and handheld. Ford Fairlane, which they named an actor after. Um, it's a Ford Fairlane 500. I don't think he was 500. And here's something else that was, well, I would never have kept this in my garage because I think it's pretty fucking awful, really. But here is the number one car ever made, the Ford Mustang. Just gorgeous. And it's the only car I know of that is convertible yet comes with a roof rack, which I think is dead handy. Um, I have a paint color similar to this. I think I painted a pick in this color, the Cadillac DeVille sedan. Very nice. Do need to work on the paint. So in 1961, the older Aston Martin resulted in a movie so successful that they decided to make a sequel, James Bond 2, The Green Car. You can see the writing on the Superleggera, which is quite interesting because the word Superleggera only really appears with Lamborghini nowadays. Who knew? Aston Martin also. They had, the sort of second car for the second sequel. And this one came complete with a motorbike. I think James Bond movies now come with, look at the gearing ratio on that thing, interesting. But nowadays, James Bond movies come with these newer models that can actually go underwater. So I think going underwater with this would cause rust and the insurance will not like you. So here we have the E-Type Jag, which I'll tell you two stories. Jeremy Clarkson talks about them a lot, and our neighbours had one in the driveway, so I simply had to ask, if you've got one of these abandoned in your driveway, what the fuck have you got in the garage? And, well, what was in the garage was a bit more impressive like that. I find if you're making half the car bonnet, it's not very economical, and you can't do grocery shopping. So I don't know. I don't know about the color. I don't know about the rims. It's never really grabbed my fancy. I just wanted to build one just to play with it. And of course, no collection is complete without the Widowmaker Porsche. It's a 930 turbo, and people did not understand turbos when they came out, and they just understood money. So people with money understood that you have to have a Porsche, and they did not quite realize that the turbo on this was very big, and it had a relatively huge turbo lag, which means when you put your foot flat, it took quite a while to spool up. And by the time it did decide to spool up, it threw so much power down to the rear wheels, and you're usually in the middle of a corner, and that was it. Widow made. That one comes with a trickle charger, which is surprising because It's not a Triumph, it's German, and but anyway, it's got one, and the bonnet's a bit open. I guess that's to act as an air brake when that turbo kicks in. It's got something on the lights, probably sprayers, but yeah, look, I've never been I've got no idea why this Mercedes Benz is here. Um, I really don't know. It's a 1999, nothing really. And quite frankly, I prefer my 280e to this. Same color though, but doesn't look as great. Back in the day when Bugatti was Bugatti. Handmade, 1925, and well, not much can be said about this except no car is no car collection is complete without it, and it came with the little model one, which is these were found to be a little bit more advanced than what you find in a Hot Wheels collection nowadays. Um, that's a racing car because it looks like one, and that belonged to Sam Tingle. He liked to go fast, like around corners, so they put Mursa tires on the back. The old Schecter's cars, I think they, I think they're driving something a bit more modern nowadays. The Elf, I think that was a Renault Elf, and Lexington number one. That's where that logo came from. It doesn't have a John Player special one, uh, but then he moved on to a Ford, so I don't know about that wisdom. Had a headrest though, that's nice. And unlike Team Gunston didn't have a headrest. It was just really fast. It needed something steel, so crack your head on it. And you can see the theme of really big rear tires continuing throughout motor racing. Yes, it helps with cornering, and of course a little model. I think I need to up my game because the Toyland I made was nothing near this, and of course nothing is complete without a Ford Escort. And no, there's a Ford Capri, and but it's not complete. He doesn't have a Ford Escort in here, but he's got a V8, so I guess that belongs there. And Basil Green, right? And of course a BMW. So say no more. They're very proud of their cars, which is why they have BMW badges all over the show. And they didn't really find space. It was so low on the bottom to put the shocks in, so they just put them in the bonnet, which I guess, well, if it works, it works. If you squint, it's mint. And that's lovely. Looks like they stole the inlets from a CBR 1000, but that's the Dion Hubert West Bank BMW.